Hello my fellow weebs and welcome back to the One Piece Saga, the series where I undergo the never-ending journey of watching through One Piece for the very first time, giving my thoughts on it and ranking each arc in a tier list, to determine which is definitively, mathematically, chemically, and definitely not just in my opinion, the best one. As per usual, if you're new to the series, I'd recommend going back to the first video to hear all the rules and technicalities of how the series works, and to avoid confusion as well as spoilers. But with that out of the way, let's take a quick look at how the tier list looks right now. After getting my miraculous wish of seeing cherry blossoms on a winter island fulfilled, the recently covered Drum Island took the second place for the best arc so far. But with the climax of the Alabasta saga and what I would call the first grand arc we've seen, is that going to change today? Well, let's not waste any more time and jump straight into the absolute behemoth that is Alabasta. I'll be honest, this is one I've been dreading due to the sheer length of this single arc. I mean, it's almost 3 times the length of Arlong Park or Drum Island, so believe me when I say that in order to write this, I had to go back to the beginning of the arc just to get a grip of how it even began. But enough dilly-dallying, we open the arc with the first proper reveal of Crocodile, where we find out that he is actually praised as the savior here, immediately setting up the idea that despite having the Princess of the Kingdom by their side, they are very much sailing into enemy territory. I really enjoyed this sort of establishing sequence that gives a solid insight into the local happenings. With how much Alabasta was cooked up already, I was very glad that they jumped straight into it. Even before seeing the Straw Hats, we get to see what they're already getting themselves into. Not much else to say here, just a nice swift introduction to the arc. Jumping over to the Straw Hats, there's the usual shenanigans on the ship, but unexpectedly, Mr. 2 appears in the water next to the Going Merry. And the whole shtick of them not knowing who the either of them are talking to worked brilliantly here. Obviously, we as the viewers know that Mr. 2 is part of Baroque Works, but the Straw Hats don't know who this guy is, and Mr. 2 doesn't know that these are the Straw Hats he should technically be hunting, so their interactions were a ton of fun to see. Also, if you recall, I haven't really liked any of the Baroque Work agents at all, but Mr. 2 seems to have broken that trend. The comedy here was on point, from the whole dancing scene to their highly emotional parting, it was all just great. But this would of course also set up a major plotline for later on. He acquires some of the Straw Hats' faces, which is very OP when you're trying to sow chaos, as we would see later on. Though thinking one step ahead, or I guess technically 2 with the reveal we'd get later, the Straw Hats all tie a bandage on their left arms to identify each other. And later in the arc, we would of course also find out that there was a marking underneath the bandage. That was a nice little twist that I really enjoyed seeing. A short while later, they arrive at Alabasta and we get lots and lots of lore, which for the sake of time we won't delve into too much, but the important part is the reveal of Dance Powder, a substance that, when burned, summons rain. And oh, did my theory-making cogs start to spin. I immediately began to think about whether my initial theory about Dragon's abilities might have been wrong then, as I thought it was his Devil Fruit power that allowed him to manipulate weather, though with the introduction of this Dance Powder, I think it is much more likely that he could have used something like that instead. For now, that's just a quick thought. Moving on, we see the squad get new outfits, which in my opinion is one of the coolest things to see in a series like this. We see the characters grow in many ways, they get more powerful, they become more mature, etc. But it's always just sort of a background thing. But when they suddenly look different, or even as I mentioned in the previous video, change the way they call each other, that's when you get this immediate feedback of visual progression. Think of video games for example. If you have the chance between being marginally stronger or getting a cool new outfit, which would you pick? I think as long as it's not some sort of super competitive thing, you'd rather just look cool, right? And so, I think them getting a new look once we get into these grander stories is a very, very nice change. Speaking of grander stories, this is also the first ever arc where we've had these proper before-on segments. Usually it's just the most important moments of the past episode being cut together, but with Alabasta being as huge as it is, we get a short recap as well as a visual representation of where the important characters are, which I thought was a very nice little touch. Obviously in my case, I was binging it, so it didn't really add anything for me, but watching it weekly, I can definitely see how for this large of a story, it is a good idea to have this sort of segment. And not more than 3 episodes in, things start to get very interesting, as we see Ace, Tashigi, and Smoker already chilling in Alabasta. Again, there's way too much that happens here, so we'll just go over the important bits. First, we find out that Ace is a part of the Whitebeard Pirates, another crew that has extreme notoriety, with Smoker knowing them very well already. And we then just get the absolute bombshell that this guy is Luffy's brother. I'll be honest, I've never even thought about Luffy's family at all for some reason. What, are we going to find out the dragon is his father now? And Gold Roger is his long-lost uncle who gave him cool presents on Christmas? Now I'm messing around, but yeah, this was a solid twist that really caught me off guard. But perhaps just as importantly, we get his full name, Porcus D. Ace. We'll talk about this particular fact closer to the end of the arc just to not make this whole thing too disjointed, so do keep that in mind. But this whole sequence of Smoker, Ace, and Luffy being here was just absolutely awesome. And I won't lie, the duel between Ace and Smoker gave me the final Agni Kai vibes. I mean, this guy is a firebender and he does have a bit of a Zuko vibe. But jokes aside, their power levels are absolutely insane. I mean, we see a whole fleet of Baroque Works' ships appear, and Ace one-shots them. Chef's kiss. But speaking a little more broadly, I've absolutely loved seeing Smoker appear in the story, so this sort of dual-sided approach to Alabasta had me very, very intrigued. And following this, we get a little bit more lore about Blackbeard, as well as the rebel army which is stationed in the town of Yuba. I said this in my previous video, but again, if Blackbeard is not like an S tier character, I'ma be real mad. You do not drop the name Blackbeard and don't deliver. Anyway, Ace decides to tag along with the Straw Hats, and so our journey into the vast desert begins. We get a bunch of super comedic scenes here. First, we see the lizard runners, which for some reason almost made me die of laughter. Something about them just hit a funny bone for me. But then we also get the Kung Fu seals, which were just on point. As I often say, they're nothing super major or important, but they would still play a minor role in future events, and they were just a ton of fun to see. Also again, their new outfits are super cool here. I especially vibe with Luffy's look. The next couple of episodes really gave me the desert vibes from Avatar. We see them get quite demoralized, and even simply surviving in the desert is already hard. Then of course, some birds rob them. Well, sometimes you get it, sometimes you get got, right? We also see some more massive creatures appear that the gang has to fight, but I do have to say that some parts of this felt a little dragged out, especially knowing how long the arc is already. On one hand, I think this very long period of time where we actually see them cross the desert does help with immersion and giving a sense of scale, but on the other, I found myself thinking that some of those challenges were thrown in just because. And even retrospectively, while most of these little tidbits did play into the larger narrative in some aspects, I don't think they were exactly necessary. But that may totally just be a me thing, so I'm not exactly sure. What I absolutely love though is when Luffy drank some cactus juice. You know me, of course, The only thing I could think of was Saga and his cactus juice ad, so I was laughing my head off here. This is very much deserving of the chef's kiss. Moving on, we also finally get a proper flashback episode for Vivi, which introduces her relationship to Koza, the leader of the rebellion. As usual, I really like seeing these as they always do a very good job of fleshing out characters even further. Especially in the case of Vivi, as she is very much at the center of the arc, much more so than even the rest of the Straw Hats. Not much else to say here, I just think that this flashback episode did a very good job of making their relationship later in the arc a lot more believable. Returning to the present, Ace learns that Blackbeard is not in Alabasta, and so he heads off on his own mission, but not before giving Luffy a very ambiguous blank piece of paper. Absolutely no idea what it is meant to be, but Luffy does attach it to his hat later, so it will definitely come into play at some point. Currently though, I am all out of ideas. But somewhat related to what I mentioned before about some parts feeling a little dragged out, we see Luffy, Chopper, and Zoro end up in some sort of underground temple. And personally, I think this was a perfect example of just one of those things that didn't really serve any purpose. Something about it might have just flown over my head, but the only thing it did was tease the ancient writings? Other than that, they just got out of there and it's never really brought up again. But my conflicted thoughts were soon changed as we see the high-up members of Baroque Works all meet up at a bar. And we've got everyone here, Mr. 4 and Miss Merry Christmas, who I found extremely obnoxious by the way, Mr. 2, Mr. 3, Miss Doublefinger, Mr. 1, basically everyone. And it's here we learn that Crocodile's final plans are being set into motion, which certainly got me hyped for what's to come very shortly. And once again, speaking a little more broadly, I think this is where the tone of the arc flips and we properly get into the actual fighting and all that, but more on that when we get there. We then find out about Crocodile's casino. Basically, he's your stereotypical bad guy in Vegas who is seemingly a charming guy who the public loves, while in reality he has extremely twisted beliefs and/or plans. As I talked about in my Arlong Park video, I really enjoy these sorts of bad guys whose goals are more complicated than simply defeating the protagonists. Just like we saw with Arlong, Crocodile isn't really concerned with the Straw Hats as long as they wouldn't interfere with his plans, which automatically makes him a more nuanced character. And since it worked out last time, why don't I say another thing that I'd love to see? I'd really like to see a whole arc build around this sort of mastermind villain running a casino or something like that, where the Straw Hats have to go up the chain and finally meet the big bad. Basically give me more of these Vegas vibes, thank you very much. And thus, with the Straw Hats arriving in Rain Base, the location of Crocodile's casino, we get another major payoff with Smoker, as we find out that he is already here as well. Ultimately, they decide to just make a run for it and go straight for Crocodile, which leads them, as well as Smoker, who's on their trail, into one of Crocodile's traps. And here, we learn something very big that I'm honestly kind of surprised is only introduced now. The material that cancels out Devil Fruit powers. Both Smoker's sword, as well as the cage they are trapped in, is made out of this material. So there is seemingly really no way out of this. I feel like this sort of thing is pretty much a given in stories like these. You can't really have massively overpowered characters without somehow yoinking their powers away. I've never really been bothered by it. I mean, it's something that's been around forever with Superman's kryptonite and so on, but I am always impressed when a story figures out a way that they can avoid this sort of thing that just cancels out powers. I love the idea of the water being the balancing force, but now we have two, which does slowly begin to cheapen that intensity, as now the number one question to raise is why isn't this thing more common in the Navy? Again, it's not really a big deal for now, but we'll have to see how this one plays out. It can become a slippery slope very fast. Jumping over to Vivi, we see Pell swoop in on his falcon form, which I'll be honest, had me super impressed. My notes on this one simply say, now that's a devil fruit power. But on the note of this, we hear that apparently there are only 5 who possess the power of flight. Yeah, we'll see about that. Something tells me that this little detail won't hold water in around 1,000 episodes or so. But who knows, it's entirely possible that I'll be proven wrong. But despite his powers seemingly being extremely strong, we see that Miss All Sunday wipes him out without even breaking a sweat. Keep this in mind for later. We also find out Crocodile's true ability. Basically it's the same as Smoker's, just with sand, which is pretty OP considering they're in the desert. And despite the Straw Hat's best efforts, Operation Utopia begins after all, and so the war is here. We see the true power of Mr. 2, sowing seeds of absolute chaos as he impersonates the king and riles up the rebel army. And I've gotta give massive props to how well Crocodile's plan was finally revealed to us. It's very much one of those times where we've kind of already had all the information available to us, but now we are given those final pieces of information that make everything fit. We see Mr. 1 and Ms. Doublefinger arrive, delivering a massive blow to the battlefield as well, etc, etc. And I also really liked how we had that multi-sided storytelling here, where we snap to the Straw Hats who are given those crucial bits of Crocodile's plan, and then we get a macro view of what is actually happening. Not much else to say on this, it's just a great way of approaching this sort of grander narrative. But just as we begin to think that it all may be over, Sanji buzzes in, tricking Crocodile and letting the Straw Hats know that he is on his way. He defeats the crocodiles, which are some sort of weird banana gators or whatever, and gets the Straw Hats out, and here, I've gotta bring up them saving Smoker. I'm an absolute sucker for these sorts of character dynamics where Smoker obviously means to catch the Straw Hats, but they have respect for each other. So Luffy tells Zoro to save Smoker, and Smoker then lets them go away. And by the way, the animation here is on point. The sunset looks brilliant. But yeah, I really want to see the dynamics between Smoker and Luffy again. Perhaps at some point, we may see them completely unite in defeating a foe, only to turn on each other again at the very end, or something like that. Either way, he is probably my second favorite character at this point. And I'll have to butt in here with a bit of a meta comment, but like, we've already had a direct confrontation with Crocodile, and we're not even halfway through the arc yet. This is nuts. Anyway, we see Vivi being yoinked away by Crocodile, but Luffy jumps in and switches out. And thus, we get our first proper duel between Luffy and the old Croc. This one was awesome, though I'd already figured out that Luffy carrying around the small barrel of water would play into this duel. It was still really cool to see. The best part obviously has to be the complete silence as Luffy was being stabbed. The cinematography was really on point for this one. And despite obviously knowing that Luffy has plot armor strong enough to survive a 7-page Muda, it was still a great scene. Following this, we cut back to my main man Smoker, who gives Tashigi a choice, either to go after the Straw Hats or help the army, while he himself goes off on his own. Tashigi's development in this arc was honestly super surprising, and I was very happy to see her work through this decision on her own. I may have thrown shade at her in Logtown, but honestly, she's really becoming a solid character. And quick note, Karoo bringing the Supersonic Duck Squadron almost killed me. But oh boy, cutting back to Luffy, who has just been saved by Miss All Sunday, who I'll keep calling Robin from now on for the sake of simplicity. But she asks him, "Why do you fight? You who have the name of D." Wait a second. It's time for theories. I really should have brought this up in the previous episode, but I chose to address it in this one since I was already a little bit ahead at the time. Kureha casually dropped an absolute bombshell. The fact that Gold Roger is in fact Gold D Roger. So we now have Monkey D Luffy Porgus D. Ace, and Gold D. Roger. The question I now have is how names really work in this universe. Is D kind of like their surname and that means they're related? That would be backed up by Ace being Luffy's brother, of course, but I'm not really sure on that. Though based on what Robin says here, it does appear to be almost like the Joestar birthmark, signaling that this person is not to be messed with. Though that would still imply that they are in some way related. At this point, I don't think we have quite enough information to piece this together, but oh boy, if we find out that there really is some sort of bloodline of extremely strong-willed people, and that Roger is like Luffy's grandfather or something, it would be pretty interesting to say the least. Alright, enough about that. Now I want to talk about what might just be my biggest problem with this entire arc, and honestly, I'm starting to feel like this problem isn't exclusive to this arc either. We see that Pell managed to survive his original quote-unquote death, which is okay, fine. But jumping ahead quite a bit, we will see him literally carry a bomb into the sky and blow up with it, yet he still miraculously returns. And then we find out that Igaram is also actually alive and it is just never addressed. I mean, did we not watch him literally disintegrate? One explanation that I would accept is that maybe Robin didn't actually kill either of them, but then why and how did Pell survive the blast in the sky? That had nothing to do with Robin. And the whole story part is honestly even beside the point. The problem I have is us being deliberately baited into thinking these characters die. One of you left a very good and insightful comment about this in the previous video, saying that death in One Piece always has to signify something and it is not to be taken lightly. And I absolutely agree that this is how it should be approached, and in a lot of cases, it has. Think Zoro and Kuina, Nami and Bellemere, etc. But in the case of Pell and Igaram, we were simply baited multiple times into thinking that they did indeed die, with absolutely no reasoning. Again, in story, you can explain a couple of them away through Robin actually being a good character. Like we saw the hands before Igaram's death, which would signify that maybe she did indeed save him, but from an audience point of view, I can't help but think that I should doubt every single thing from now on, even if we see their death on screen. And even taking Robin into account, my suspension of disbelief is still a little broken when a literal nuke goes off and a character somehow manages to survive it without the smallest of injuries. Yeah, I was honestly kind of burned by this aspect. And big thank you to Ellie Tours for the comment, by the way. But let's not dwell on the negative notes and move on. We see that the battle between the armies is now in full swing. Karoo is of course once again the absolute MVP, fighting through the pain and generally being an absolute chat. But before we get into the smaller fights, we learn something that has huge implications for the future. The fact that inanimate objects can eat devil fruits. Apparently, it is a new technique that is unknown to most people, but it is somehow possible. This is again one of those things that going forward, I'll just have to keep in mind as a possibility that can crop up. But alright, let's get into the kinda but not really one-on-one fights. And we won't go through every single detail as we'd be here for just way too long. Firstly, Sanji vs Mr. 2 was really fun to see, especially the whole capoeira style fighting. And the end of the fight of them kind of respecting each other as fighters was a chef's kiss. Secondly, the Nami fight was also really interesting, especially when we get the flashback of her feeling guilty that she cannot fight. The whole showdown was obviously very comedy heavy, but I do think it was a good character building sequence for sure. Chopper and Usopp vs Mr. 4 and Miss Merry Christmas was probably my least favorite fight of all. The dynamic between Chopper and Usopp was on point, but I absolutely despised Mr. 4 and Miss Merry Christmas. So yeah, it kind of fell flat for me, especially with how dragged out I found parts of it. And also they use metric, just saying. My favorite fight has to be Zoro vs Mr. 1. As usual, the cinematography here was absolutely on point, and his whole journey of taking his sword skills to the next level and being able to cut steel was yet another chef's kiss. This one was a real pleasure to watch, and once again it just cemented Zoro as my favorite of the cast so far. And the last one, which isn't really a battle per se, but is perhaps the most important one, and that is Vivi. It feels like I haven't really talked about her much this video, despite how centric the arc is on her, so don't take it as me pushing her story to the side. It's just a case of simply not being able to fit everything in. But we see Vivi finally break from that super overprotective state of thinking as she commands the army to destroy the palace. No one would obviously die, but she is blowing up thousands of years of history. I think her journey in this arc was written extremely well. Broadly speaking, she is the main character and receives a lot of screen time here. But despite being introduced just a few short arcs before, her story was extremely gripping the whole way through. It's also at this point when we get a brand new opening. And while I'd love to praise it for the absolute banger of a song that is the third OP, who in their right mind decided to add Robin into this OP? It's literally like we're watching them pretty much try to kill each other, and the OP has Robin be like, "Hi." I definitely saw a comment warning me about that, but I thought, it's probably something minor that only becomes super important later and I wouldn't really notice. But like, they show her like 30 times. Why? Just move it like 3 episodes, come on. Anyway, getting back to the plot, we get to see Tashigi again, who runs into Luffy. Only this time, she understands that if they wish to take down Crocodile, she has to help him, and so goes against what she herself wants. She points him to Crocodile. Again, just building her up as a character. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing her pop up sometime in the future. And we also get the absolutely brilliant line of Luffy seeing the secret staircase and saying, "That hole, it looks gatorish," as he runs down it. Chef's kiss. I laughed harder than I'd like to admit at that one. The Luffy vs Crocodile fight was awesome, but even better was Vivi screaming from atop the clock tower. The constant tick-tock of Pell's death, which again wasn't actually a death, and the shot of her being almost tiny as if looking through a keyhole into a much larger world was on point. And the voice actress just screaming at the top of her lungs carried that desperation flawlessly. It was a really awesome moment for sure. But then, rain suddenly begins as they realize there is nothing left to fight for, as Crocodile's body lands in the middle of the square. And thus, a triumphant theme plays as we see the defeated Crocky. Alabasta is saved. Except it isn't, because we take a more realistic approach to this sort of conflict. A leader falling, or even the problem being solved, does not end the fighting. The people are still riled up. But then, the immortal Igaram returns with the boy who just saw Mr. 2 acting as the king, and telling people that it was Baroque Works who incited this violence. And now, with them finally realizing that they have been played all along, Vivi and Cobra go to address the people, as everyone finally just collapses. And now, the mission really is complete. The shot of them just straight up falling over of exhaustion as soon as Vivi leaves is very much deserving of the chef's kiss. Soon after, the Marines move in, but Tashigi denies arresting the exhausted Straw Hats, which is again a massive win for her as a character in my book. And if that wasn't enough, we see her return to Smoker, where she straight up tells Smoker that she let the pirates go. And the scene of her trying to hide her crying while Smoker just tells her if she's frustrated enough to cry, she should just become stronger. Yes, I know, another chef's kiss. And then we see the absolute corruption that is actually within the Marines, as they push the capture of Crocodile onto Smoker and Tashigi. With him being the absolute Chad that he is, he straight up calls them out on their b****s and tells them that he didn't do it. And he even calls them out saying that his subordinates, that being Tashigi, is in tears because they couldn't. I mean, how can you not like this dude? Not only is he much complex than a simple quote-unquote good marine, but he's also not afraid of calling out what is clear injustice and protecting his own allies. Not to mention the conversation to be had around the government covering up the true heroes of the story, etc. Cutting back to the Straw Hats, we see that Luffy is the only one that is yet to wake up. But when he does, he obviously asks for his hat, then breakfast, then his hat again, and then breakfast again. This gave me a very solid chuckle. Though, we do also have to talk about something that I haven't really brought up throughout the series yet. And that is how Sanji does sometimes act straight up creepy toward women. And I think this instance of them all going to see them bathe was definitely not cool to see at all. And I get that it's supposed to be a joke, but the way I see it, that doesn't make it any better. If anything, it only makes it worse. Especially with what's recently come out about the gaming industry, for example, I really don't think these sorts of things should be normalized, let alone in a series that can be watched by younger audiences. Furthermore, the scene served absolutely no purpose, so I genuinely do not understand why it had to be there at all. This one has really aged like milk. I don't know, it was just not cool at all. But returning to the plots, we see the updated bounties for the squad, with Zoro getting a cool 60 million and Luffy 100 million. So yeah, that's a yikes. But with the Straw Hats now wanting to leave ASAP, Vivi has a decision to make of whether or not she would stay behind. And we also see that Bon Clay actually saved the Going Merry. I'm pretty sure at this point, Mr. 2 has to be my favorite character from Baroque works, aside from Robin and old Crocky himself. And honestly, him falling to the legendary Hina who we had just met, as the iconic One Piece triumphant music plays, did hit me in the feels for some reason. Like, this was a cool dude. I really want to see him again sometime in the future, especially with how little he actually appeared in the Baroque Works arcs. Also, seeing the Full Metal Guy and Hypnotist Django pop up again under this new leader was pretty interesting, so I'd expect them to reappear again sometime in the near future. But, as I think every one of us expected, Vivi just has to stay behind, but not before coming to say goodbye. And the scene of them realizing that they cannot answer back, as the Marines would realize that Vivi has been in contact with the Straw Hats, and then holding up the mark. My notes sum this up very well. They can't answer, so they held up the mark. Sad boy hours for real. But despite her staying behind, she will always be a member of the Straw Hats in my book. Perhaps once Alabasta has gotten back on its feet, she will rejoin the squad on the Going Merry. Who knows? And the very final episode of the Alabasta arc is very much a wrap-up. We see the king delivering a speech to the people of Alabasta. We see all the graves where, by the way, this would have been a super bittersweet scene of him standing over the grave of his closest friend, only for us to find out that Pell was bandaged up by the guy who we saw at the very start of the arc. Again, I think it just cheapened the whole thing. Another character that I don't think I've actually brought up at all yet, which I definitely should have, we see that Lashes joins up with the Supersonic Duck Squadron, which, you know, okay. But then we see our newest member, which definitely was not spoiled by the opening, as Nico Robin is already chilling on the ship. But we also find out that it was her who saved Luffy from the poison, and that the poneglyph actually said everything about the weapon Crocodile was looking for. There wasn't a word of history on it. She never intended to help Crocky anyway. And finally, she tells the Straw Hats that she is in search of the poneglyphs that carry the real history. It's not really elaborated on, but I'd wager something about the devil fruits or the tales of the Pirate King or something like that. Characters who are simply pursuing information with little to no affiliations are always a ton of fun to see, so we'll see where her adventures take us. And thus, Nico Robin joins the crew. And that's Alabasta. You have no clue how hard it was trying to put the script together for this arc. I still feel like I jumped over so many larger events, though I guess cutting down to just the parts I think were the best or the most important will have to be the way for these sorts of grander narratives. But enough about that. I think this one was a good first shot at a much larger story, and as such, while it had many things I'd consider great, for example allowing every single character to shine, I do still think it had some issues, notably the coming back to life debacle, some of the first half of the arc feeling a little dragged out, as well as some of the final standoffs being a bit hit and miss in terms of length. Though even with all that being said, I think I need to restate the amount of ground we cover in this one. Even characters like Ace already seem long gone, but all of that happened in this arc. And thus, I think we will have our second ever upset of the tier list, as Alabasta will be taking the A tier and pushing everything else down a tier. As I've said in the few previous videos, short arcs are very tricky to rate since they have no room to make mistakes, yet these super grand ones do so much that the mistakes often don't seem as bad. But I still didn't find it as enjoyable as the S tier arcs. But with all that being said, let's delve into the surprisingly exciting filler arc of Post-Alabasta. Before we get any further into specifics, I gotta say these are the types of filler arcs I am all here for. Instead of simply telling a story that is in no way relevant to anything before or after in the arc, we see episodes that are mostly centered around the characters we already know. I also think this was a very nice change of pace from the climax in Alabasta. We had like 40 episodes of the story mostly actively moving forward, and then the latter half of those 40 episodes was all about the final battle. So switching to this much more introspective, low-stakes vibe was very enjoyable. But let's get into specifics. Every single one of these episodes pretty much focuses on a single character, or in some cases a couple. The very first mini-story we get is about Chopper, though the episode is also somewhat of an introduction to Robin, who had just joined the crew. Again, there's nothing super high stakes that happens here, we just get a little more of Chopper's backstory as he talks about the first time Doctorine got sick and how he had to treat her. The second episode is a Nami-centric one, where we get to see Bellamere again and how Nami had always been curious as to just what is out there. Also, the Amazon sales dude was a ton of fun to see, but he is of course just a catalyst for Nami's flashback. Again, just a nice mini-story. The third one is all about Sanji meeting a young marine chef, who shares his dream of finding the All Blue. Here we see Sanji becoming somewhat of a mentor to this boy and helping him impress his crew. This one was really something different and almost reminded me of the cooking battle back in Logtown, so it should come as no surprise that I really enjoyed this one as well. The next one is very important in my book, as it is an Usopp-centric one, which also, kind of like Sanji's tale, is not a flashback and instead develops him through current events. I'd also say this was probably one of the most expansive stories in this mini-arc, as we see a new island that is home to a yearly fireworks festival. We learn that there's this little girl and her grandpa that are responsible for building all the fireworks on the island, which, no surprise, interests Usopp straight away. But we also find out that a tragedy happened last year. The girl's parents tried to build a massive firework, but it didn't work and resulted in their deaths. And so she wants to attempt to launch it, and Usopp is the one to help her. Once again, not a high-stakes story at all, but seeing Usopp empathize with this little girl and then ultimately fulfill her wish of launching this giant shell was a ton of fun to see, and the visuals were also pretty cool. The final episode of this filler arc is a flashback to Zoro, Johnny, and Yosuke as bounty hunters, explaining how they first met. Frankly, I'd love a whole spin-off based around Zoro's days as a bounty hunter, So again, it shouldn't come as a surprise when I say I really enjoyed this one. And I suppose this might be a little controversial since it is a filler arc, but it also recontextualizes the relationship the duo of Johnny and Yosuke have with Zoro, showing that they do really go back a long time. TLDR, more flashbacks please. And that's Post-Alabasta. This one was a super short arc at only 5 episodes, but I think it was a perfect breather after the intensity that we saw in Alabasta. As I mentioned, I feel like these sorts of introspective stories often work much better for filler arcs, as writing a side adventure that is designed not to impede on the main narrative will by default not seem important. I've heard that there are some that break that trend in the future, but so far, this one is definitely my favorite of the filler arcs so far. Hence, I think it is a very solid C tier arc. We've got a few more filler arcs to begin next video, so we'll have plenty of time to talk about my thoughts on filler and when it really does not work. Overall, I am a little torn on the way I feel about the Alabasta saga if I'm being honest. For me personally, I don't think it had the highs that the East Blue had, most notably the events of Arlong Park, which were just simply brilliant, but the lows were in some cases just as low as the East Blue. For some reason, I disliked most of the villains in this saga, which is obviously a pretty major part of the overall story. Also, and this is something that I don't really know how to put into words well, I feel like knowing the end goal for this saga, that of course being the battle for Alabasta, in some ways cheapened everything that came before, as we tried to get through everything as fast as possible. Obviously, this sort of storytelling is extremely common and is the backbone of many of my favorite series of all time, which is why I did say that I am a little torn about it here. Something about Alabasta just didn't entirely click for me. But not to leave on a negative note, I thoroughly enjoyed the now much grander narrative that is being established, with creative new plot devices, hints at legendary individuals and locations, etc, etc. But on that note, it is time to close the book on the Alabasta saga. And that's the video. As you might have been able to tell, I tried a bit of an experimental approach to this one, covering broader story aspects very briefly and focusing only on the things I found most important. Do let me know if you think we rushed through it a little too much, but I honestly had no clue how to otherwise approach covering this behemoth of an arc. But as is trend with these videos, let's do the good old test to see how many of you stuck around until the very end. Drop a comment, whatever it may be, and include the words Batman's sidekick. Let's see what you guys come up with. Other than that, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you did all the YouTube things to let the algorithm know. And if you wish to support the channel even further, consider joining the Patreon where you can pledge as little as $1 per month and get access to all of the benefits. Speaking of which, massive shout out to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these very long videos for you all. Seriously, thank you times 1,000. All of my socials and links are in the description, but other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.